The Allegheny National Forest had always seemed like a good idea. Its reputation for untouched wilderness and solitude was exactly what I was looking for, a break from the grind of city life and a chance to reconnect with nature. When my friends proposed the trip in the summer of 2015, I jumped at the opportunity. But nothing could have prepared me for the nightmare waiting in those woods. We set out early Friday morning, 2 cars loaded with supplies, laughter filling the air as we left the city behind. There were 4 of us: Tom, Jake, Sarah, and me. Tom was the planner of the group, the guy who always had a map and a checklist. Jake was the jokester, his humor keeping us entertained even when the drive felt endless. Sarah, quiet but sharp, often played the voice of reason. And then there was me, always looking for the next adventure, always ready to push the boundaries. The drive was uneventful until we reached the narrow, winding road leading to the forest. The towering pines loomed overhead, their shadows stretching long across the pavement. Something about the way the trees closed in around us felt almost oppressive, as if the forest itself was alive and watching. We arrived at our chosen campsite just before sunset. It was a small clearing surrounded by dense trees, far enough off the main trails to promise privacy. The air was cool and heavy with the scent of pine. We unloaded our gear, set up the tents, and built a fire. As the flames crackled and the sky darkened, the world around us seemed to shrink, the forest closing in like a living wall. It wasn't until the first flicker of unease settled over me that I noticed how quiet it had become. The usual sounds of the forest, chirping crickets, rustling leaves, had faded into an unnatural silence. "You guys feel that?" I asked, my voice barely louder than the crackling fire. "Feel what?" Jake replied, his grin faltering as he looked at me. "Like something is watching us." Sarah rolled her eyes. "Don't start with the ghost stories already." But Tom was frowning, his gaze fixed on the shadows just beyond the firelight. "Hez right," he said. "It feels off." We tried to shake it off, chalking it up to the eerie atmosphere of being so far from civilization. But as the hours passed, that sense of unease only grew stronger. The wind picked up, rustling the branches above, and with it came the whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, soft, low murmurs blending with the rustling leaves. But as I listened, the sound became distinct, deliberate. Words, spoken in a language I couldn't understand, carried on the breeze. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. We all nodded, too afraid to speak. The whispers seemed to circle us, coming from all directions, just beyond the reach of the firelight. "It's gotta be the wind," Jake said, though his voice was shaky. "Right? Just the wind." Tom stood, his flashlight in hand, and pointed it into the trees. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there, just trees swaying in the wind. "Hello?" he called out. His voice sounded small, swallowed by the vastness of the forest. The whispers stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening, heavier than before. Then came the footsteps, soft, deliberate, crunching through the underbrush. They circled the campsite, just beyond the firelight, slow and methodical. "Who's out there?" Tom demanded, his voice cracking. No answer. The footsteps continued, never coming closer, never retreating, just circling, round and round. Panic set in. We huddled closer to the fire, clutching whatever we could use as weapon sticks, a hunting knife, even a tent pole. The footsteps stopped as abruptly as they had started, leaving us in suffocating silence once more. We decided to take turns keeping watch that night, though none of us could truly sleep. When my turn came, I sat by the dying embers of the fire, flashlight in hand, straining to hear anything beyond the pounding of my own heart. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the silence more oppressive than ever. And then I saw it, a figure, just at the edge of the clearing. It stood motionless, half hidden by the trees, its silhouette barely visible in the dim light. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it wasn't alone. More figures emerged from the shadows, their shapes barely discernible against the darkness. I froze, unable to look away. They didn't move, didn't make a sound. They just stood there, watching. "Tom," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Tom, wake up." He stirred, groggy and disoriented. What's... Look, I hissed, pointing toward the edge of the clearing. By the time he turned, the figures were gone. The next morning, we debated whether to leave. Tom argued that we should stay, after all. We had traveled so far, and it was probably just our imaginations running wild. Jake agreed, though he didn't seem convinced. Sarah and I were less sure, but in the end, we decided to stay one more night. That was our mistake. The second night was worse. The whispers returned, louder this time, more insistent. The footsteps were faster, more erratic, darting closer to the tents before retreating. And then there were the shadows, elongated, distorted shapes that danced just beyond the firelight, flickering like phantoms in the darkness. At one point, Jake swore he saw a face peering at him through the trees, pale, featureless, and inhuman. We were too terrified to sleep, huddled together by the fire, our nerves fraying with each passing hour. The forest seemed alive, its shadows shifting, its whispers growing louder, more menacing. And then, around midnight, the fire went out. The darkness was absolute, swallowing us whole. I scrambled for my flashlight, my hands trembling, but the beam of light barely penetrated the oppressive blackness. "Stay together," Tom whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. But then came the laughter. It started as a low, guttural chuckle, growing louder and more distorted until it echoed all around us. It was inhuman, guttural, and wrong, as if the forest itself was mocking us. We couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing what little we could carry, we ran, stumbling through the darkness, the laughter and whispers following us, growing louder, closer. The forest seemed to twist around us, the trees looming larger, their branches clawing at us as we fled. I could feel something behind me, its breath hot on my neck, but I didn't dare look back. We ran until we found the trail, until we saw the faint glow of our cars in the distance. Only then did we stop, gasping for breath, our hearts racing. We didn't speak as we piled into the cars, peeling out of there as fast as the narrow road would allow. It wasn't until we were miles away that someone finally broke the silence. "What the hell was that?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. None of us had an answer. To this day, I can't explain what happened in those woods. We never went back, and we never spoke of it again. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear the whispers. And I know they're waiting. This haunting memory serves as a chilling reminder. Some places are meant to remain untouched. The forest may call to you with its promises of peace and solitude. But beware, it may not be the only thing watching. I was a park ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains back in 2003. My name is Nathan Caldwell. It's been over 20 years since that autumn. But not a day passes without me thinking about what happened. Some nights, I still hear the wind carrying faint voices, and even now, I refuse to hike alone. I tell myself it's caution, but deep down, I know the truth. Fear doesn't leave you. It just learns to sit quietly in the corner of your mind. I have always believed the mountains held secrets. The Smokies are older than memory itself, older than the paths carved through them. They stretch like ancient sentinels, watching silently, indifferent to the small lives that pass beneath their shadows. I felt that indifference every day I worked there. The forest doesn't care about you. If you listen too closely, you'll hear it whisper that truth. The story I am about to tell you isn't one I have shared often. I have mentioned bits and pieces over the years, but the full weight of it, the dark, unrelenting heaviness, has stayed with me alone. Maybe it's guilt. Maybe it's because no one wants to believe something like this could happen in a place so beautiful. It started on a cold October morning. I remember the sky was slate gray, and the mist clung to the trees like spider silk. A small group of hikers signed in at the Deep Creek trailhead. 2 couples, Mark and Dana, along with Eric and his girlfriend Rachel. Young, energetic, the kind of people who brought brand new gear and wore hiking boots that still looked fresh out of the box. They didn't stand out at the time. Just another group looking for an adventure before the cold set in for good. The Smokies have that effect on people. They draw you in, make you feel like you're part of something bigger. The 4 of them were planning to hike about 10 miles in and camp overnight. Nothing too extreme, but far enough that they'd be away from the main trails. There was nothing out of the ordinary when they left. They laughed, joked around, and took photos at the sign like everyone else. I remember Rachel had a bright red jacket that practically glowed against the muted tones of the forest. By Saturday night, they should have been back. When they didn't return, no one was too worried at first. People misjudged their timing all the time. Maybe they camped longer, took a different route. It happens. But when Sunday afternoon came and there was still no sign of them, we were sent to check their route. That's when we found the campsite. It was tucked just off the trail, in a clearing that overlooked the valley. The tents were still standing, unzipped but untouched. The fire pit was cold, though a stack of unused wood sat beside it. Their bags were there, fully packed, leaning against a fallen log. But there was no sign of Mark, Dana, Eric, or Rachel. I remember walking around the campsite, calling their names. Birds chirped in the distance, leaves crunched beneath my boots. But otherwise, it was silent. Too silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then I saw it. A journal, lying face down in the dirt beside one of the tents. It wasn't soaked, so it hadn't been there long. I knelt down, brushing the leaves off the cover. The leather was soft and worn, the kind of thing you buy at a roadside gift shop. When I opened it, I saw neat handwriting in black ink. It was Dana's journal. Most of the entries were normal. Details about the hike, inside jokes, comments about the scenery. But the last entry, that's what stopped me cold. It was short. They have been following us for hours now. I thought it was just animals at first, but now I know better. Mark doesn't believe me. He says we're imagining things, but Rachel hears them too. I don't know how much longer we can keep going. They know we see them. I am sure they know. I read it twice, then 3 times. The edges of the page were smudged as if Dana's hand had shaken while she wrote. I didn't want to believe it, but something about that entry felt wrong. Uncomfortably real. We searched until nightfall, but there was no sign of them. No footprints leading away from the campsite. It was as if the forest had swallowed them whole. The next day, we expanded the search. More rangers, more volunteers. I remember watching them fan out across the woods, calling names that disappeared into the trees without echo. Midway through the afternoon, one of the volunteers, an older man named Henry, found something about a mile from the campsite. He was pale, shaking as he led me to it. It was a pile of rocks, carefully stacked, almost like a cairn. And wedged beneath them was Mark's watch, still ticking. The strap had been cut clean through. I have been a ranger for a long time. I've found lost hikers, stumbled across remains that had been out there far too long. But something about this. It felt deliberate. Personal. That evening, we set up camp near the site. There were 5 of us. No one said it out loud, but none of us wanted to be alone. The woods changed as the sun set. The shadows stretched longer than they should have. The trees creaked and groaned as if something unseen shifted beneath their roots. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of footsteps just beyond the edge of the clearing. Slow, deliberate. I stayed perfectly still, listening as the steps circled our camp once, twice, then stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By the 5th day, the search was officially called off. There was no evidence of animal attack, no sign of a struggle. It was as if the 4 of them had simply walked away. But I knew better. I didn't believe in ghosts. Not really. But the mountains don't care what you believe. They hold their secrets close. And if you're not careful, you might become one of them. A week after the search ended, I hiked back to the site alone. I don't know why. Maybe I needed closure. Maybe I thought I could find something everyone else had missed. I found the journal exactly where I left it, half buried under leaves. I flipped to the last page again, my hands cold, despite the sun overhead. Beneath Dana's final entry, there was something new. 4 words, scrawled in dirt across the paper. Now they know too. I haven't been back to Deep Creek since. That was a final decision. I didn't sleep that night. The wind picked up, howling through the mountains, but it wasn't just the wind anymore. That damn whistle. It cut through the night like a blade, sharp and deliberate, as if whoever or whatever was doing it was right behind me, breathing down my neck. My eyes flicked to every shadow in the distance, but all I saw were the jagged silhouettes of rocks, cast long and distorted in the moonlight. The air felt alive. Too alive, like it was watching, waiting. Every gust of wind made the hairs on my arms stand straight. I tried to tell myself it was just a bird, or maybe a breeze playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling. The next morning, I was too exhausted to even process what had happened. But when I unzipped my tent, my stomach lurched in terror. I didn't see it right away. I should have. But when I stepped outside, there was something wrong, something off, about the way the dirt around my campsite had shifted. The ground was clawed up, deep gouges like animal tracks, but they were too large, too uneven. The dirt wasn't just scratched, it was ripped open, as though something huge, something feral, had scraped its way across the earth. The pattern was all wrong. These weren't the usual marks you'd see from a coyote or a bear. These were jagged, erratic, unnatural, like a hand. No. Claws had torn into the earth itself, digging deep into the soil. And as I stood there, I could feel something shift in the air. The temperature dropping, the tension thick and suffocating. But it wasn't just the ground that unnerved me. I turned, and my stomach sank like I'd been punched in the gut. My RV was parked nearby, and it was covered. At first, I thought it was some kind of shadow or dirt, but then I saw the truth. The sides of the RV were marked, covered in claw marks. Deep slashing gashes that went through the metal, tearing at the surface like some animal had used its talons to scratch at it for hours. No animal could have done that. No coyote. No bear. And I knew, even then, that whatever had made those marks was still out there, watching me, waiting. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at those scratches, my heart hammering in my chest. But something was off about the air. It was too still, too quiet. Not even the wind stirred. It was as if the desert had fallen silent in the face of whatever was stalking me. I wanted to move, to run, but my feet wouldn't cooperate. I was rooted to the spot, the adrenaline and fear coursing through me, making my head spin. Then, it came again. That whistle. But this time, it was different. This time, it was close. I whipped around, my heart thumping in my throat, the air thick with a sickening sense of dread. There was nothing there. Just the same jagged rocks and dead brush, the same oppressive desert stretching on for miles. But I could feel it. Feel something moving. Something unnatural. Just outside. The edge of my vision. A flicker in the shadows. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. I don't know how much time passed. Could have been minutes. Could have been hours. But I couldn't stand there anymore. I grabbed my backpack, threw everything into the car, and started the engine. I was panicked, my hands shaking, the cold sweat sticking to my back. I didn't care about the damage to the RV or my gear. I needed to leave. But as I pulled away from the campsite, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. A figure. It was standing in the distance, just on the edge of the road, too far to make out clearly. But there was no mistaking the shape of it. Tall, gaunt, with long, thin limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its head was tilted to the side, like it was studying me, watching me. Its body barely moved in the windless air, as though it was waiting. I slammed my foot down on the gas, the engine roaring as I sped down the road. The image of that thing seared into my mind. I tried to convince myself I was just imagining things. Maybe it was just some weird trick of the light, the kind of thing your mind plays on you when you're alone in the wilderness for too long. But the further I drove, the more I realized that whatever I had seen was real. And it was still following me. I could feel it. Every nerve in my body screaming. A constant weight on my chest. I didn't stop driving for hours. Not until the first light of dawn broke over the horizon and the oppressive, choking darkness began to lift. I finally pulled over at a small diner on the outskirts of the park, my hands shaking as I reached for the door handle. When I stepped out, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It was like the air itself had shifted, thickened, as if the desert was holding its breath. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. The rangers at the entrance asked if everything had been okay, But I just nodded, muttering something about rough weather and needing a break. The whistle, the scratches. That thing, I didn't want to talk about it. I couldn't. They wouldn't believe me. But I wasn't the only one who heard it. Weeks later, I found out through a series of whispers and rumors from other campers who had been in Big Bend that same night. They had heard the same damn whistle, the same scratching, the same feeling of being hunted. Some of them hadn't stuck around long enough to see the damage I had witnessed on my RV. Others had. But they had all said the same thing. They saw something out there. Something tall and strange. Something unnatural. Park rangers were baffled. They found no evidence of any wildlife in the area. No tracks, no clues, just the claw marks. Just the strange, eerie whistling in the night. They claimed it was just a freak occurrence, a fluke, but I knew better. I had felt it. I had seen it. And I knew it was still out there. That night, when I closed my eyes, I could still hear that whistle, clear as ever. Too close. Too real. I didn't dare look out the window. I couldn't. I could still feel the weight of those eyes on me, the oppressive feeling that had followed me from the desert. And somewhere, out there, in the silent, endless dark, something was waiting for me to come back. Something was watching, listening for that familiar, terrified sound. But this time, I wouldn't make the mistake of running. Next time, it would find me.